Today, Sony took the wraps off the PS5, so let's take a deep dive into exactly what's new and how it compares to the Xbox Series X. So definitely a couple of key takeaways. First of all, and it should be a surprise to exactly no one, is that the PS5 is significantly faster than the PS4 Pro that it's replacing. What's also a bit of a surprise is how the PS5 stacks up with the Xbox Series X. It is certainly not a clean sweep, but that Series X has a lot going for it, but I'll get a little bit more into that in just a second. Something else that's really surprising here is what the backwards compatibility story looks like. Now obviously on the Xbox side of things, we have pretty much full backwards compatibility all the way back to a lot of original Xbox games. Now on the PS5, thankfully we do have some backwards compatibility, but it pretty much only extends to PS4 games, and even at that level, it's only some PS4 games. They're aiming to have most of them available at launch, but it's not going to be quite as smooth as on the Xbox front from what I'm seeing here. Alright, so for this one, Jimmy, can I have my nerd hat please? Thank you very much. So, with our nerd hats on, inside the PS5, we have an 8-core Ryzen-based processor. So we have 8 Zen cores with hyper-threading, and this is very similar to what we have on the Xbox, as well as of course Ryzen on the PC front. So it's roughly equivalent to a Ryzen 7 3700X, although it is running at lower clock speeds. In this case, up to 3.5 gigahertz. Now, I'll go much more in depth on that one in a second, but this is a huge step up over what we have on the current generation of consoles. Now, where the PS5 really does differ from the Xbox Series X is with the graphics side of things. So it does have the same base RDNA 2.0 core, so that means you have things like ray tracing that's just baked in, but the way they've configured it is very different. So, to put it in a nutshell, the PS5 has a smaller GPU, which is running at a higher clock speed. Now there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages to this. So one of the big advantages is that a smaller GPU is going to be theoretically easier to cool, but more importantly for Sony, cheaper to manufacture. So that does lend some credence to the fact that the PS5 will likely be a little bit cheaper than Series X. But the way that they've accomplished this performance means that it is actually not as powerful as the Xbox Series X. Although to be fair, if you look at the Xbox One versus PS4, the PS4 was much more powerful. This is a little bit of a closer fight. But the way that they're accomplishing that performance is kind of unusual because they're actually pushing this thing super hard. Now, part of the reason they're able to get such high clock speeds out of it is because it is a variable clock speed or a boost speed. So this is something we see a lot on the PC side of things, but it's a little bit of a disadvantage potentially on console. So if you take a look at the Xbox Series X, the CPU and the GPU run at a fixed clock speed all the time, the end, right? So if you're a developer, you're designing it to run at exactly that clock speed, you have no worries. Whereas with the PS5, it will go up to 3.5 gigahertz on CPU. It will go up to 2.23 gigahertz on the GPU, which to be fair is like more powerful than pretty much anyone is able to get out of one of these RDNA 2.0 GPUs. But the downside though, is that that's not a fixed level of performance. To me, what I'm looking at here is a PS5 which on the main system components, the CPU and the GPU, is not as powerful as the Xbox Series X and could potentially be a little bit lower if it does start to throttle. Now some of the rest of the specs actually get much more interesting on the PS5 side. So memory is quite similar between the Series X and PS5. They both have 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, although the PS5 actually has a slight disadvantage there, but we'll get into that in a second. Where there's a serious advantage for the PS5, however, is in the SSD. So obviously SSDs this generation are going to be significantly faster, like literally orders of magnitude faster than last generation. But the way that the Sony approach is this time is different. So first of all, the PS5 has an 825 gigabyte SSD, a very strange number, although it's not a standard SSD, so it's actually built into the PS5, and essentially they've done everything they can to customize it to be as quick as possible. That means that worlds can be bigger. That means that there can be much more detailed textures, which makes sense considering you have so much power on the rest of the console. And it also means that things can be ready to go pretty much instantly, right? So we've already seen this with the Xbox, and obviously that's a slower SSD, where load times have been cut from like 30 seconds to 10 seconds. And with optimization, and especially with some of the stuff that Sony's doing, we can expect incredibly quick load times this generation.
They're saying they want almost no load times.
Well, I'll believe that when I see it, right? Because yes, even if you're at like 8 gigabytes a second, you still have 16 gigs of G6 memory to fill. So I mean, we're still talking a couple seconds, and that's like best case scenario. So I still feel like we'll be looking at a few seconds of load times, but it is going to be so much better than last generation. Like, the old consoles are going to look slow, although they already look slow. when you load like Red Dead.
So with the 825 gigabyte SSD on the PS5, is that usable space?
No. So that is raw. So what you're actually going to get out of the box on the PS5 is likely going to be significantly less than that, which is unfortunate considering that's, well, obviously a downgrade from what you get on like a standard PS4 or PS4 Pro today. Now there is, however, expandable storage. So the way that Sony has approached it this generation is actually not that different than what they've done in the past. So there is a standard NVMe slot built into the PS5. So we don't actually know what the hardware will look like, but I assume there'll be like some hatch or some panel to open it up. But you can plug a standard PCI 4.0 SSD in and instantly increase your storage capacity by a lot. However, while that sounds great in theory, realistically, the PS5 has a very high level of performance that it expects, right? All of these generation of consoles, they all want super fast SSDs and they want very consistent performance. So while technically you can just put in a PCI 4.0 SSD off the shelf, first of all, you need something which is going to actually fit. So most of these SSDs that are available right now have like big beefy heat sinks or fans which will not fit. And on top of that, it actually needs to be quick enough, just full stop. So Sony are running a program where they're going to be validating drives. So theoretically, you could just stick anything in, but it very well either may load slow or may not work at all for games. So this is something which I think is going to be more of a future-proof style thing. I don't know if there are any SSDs that will be on sale by the end of this year, which you can just plug and play into the PS5. Which, to your point, Jimmy, you can still plug in USB hard drives. But if you want to play your PS5 games, you're pretty much limited to that 825 gig SSD for now until you can further expand it. Which, if you compare it to the Xbox Series X, while you do have to buy those expansion modules will be available presumably day one, and you can buy as many of them as you need. So it's going to be an interesting generation this time because there are some legitimately huge differences in performance and capabilities between the Xbox Series X and the PS5. All right, boys, let's tighten our nerd hats because we're gonna go one level deeper now. And I'm gonna push my hat one level deeper. So there are a couple of additional things that they talked about. So they have a Tempest audio engine. Now this is something which is meant to give you much more accurate. I know they've used the phrase like ray tracing for audio, but essentially it is to be a little bit more positionally accurate. And there's a lot of interesting things they've done by essentially repurposing like not quite GPU cores, but something kind of similar to give you much higher fidelity audio. But we'll see how that works and we'll see which developers actually fully take advantage of that. And of course, we do still have a Blu-ray drive on board. My nerd hat's a little too low. We have a 100 gigabyte custom Blu-ray, but it does now support 4K UHD Blu-rays as well. So after a very busy week of console announcements and news, the real question here is how does the PS5 stack up with the Xbox Series X? So, first of all, with the CPU, they are very similar. They both take advantage of 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 designs. So again, very similar to high-end Ryzen. And the really only major difference is that the Xbox can clock a little bit higher. So the PS5 is at 3.5 gigahertz with full 16 threads, you have everything available. However, that is a variable clock speed. So it's up to 3.5, but could go lower. Whereas with the Xbox Series X, with everything on, you're at 3.6 gigahertz. And if you would like to turn off that multi-threading and just get pure clock speed, you can go all the way up to 3.8. So there's no doubt this is a win for the Xbox. Next up for graphics, what we have on the PS5 is again an RDNA 2.0 GPU. So these are very comparable GPUs, but the configurations are very different. So the PS5 has 36 CUs, available at 2.23 gigahertz. However, again, that is a boost frequency, so it likely will come down sometimes. However, on the Xbox side, we have 52 CUs at 1.8 gigahertz. So when you put that all together, the Xbox has a confirmed speed of 12 teraflops, whereas the PS5 can go up to 10.2 teraflops. And we will see that sort of vary based on the actual load of the games. Now, this is another case where it seems like the Xbox has a clear win, but the difference is that I believe the Xbox will likely need more power to hit that. And obviously we've seen with the design of the Xbox Series X, it's a bigger system, it needs that huge vapor chamber. Whereas with the PS5, we don't know what it looks like, but I would hazard a guess to say that it was going to be a little bit smaller than the Series X and might be a little bit closer to what we have, like a traditional console like the PS4 Pro. But putting that aside, best case scenario, PS5 is still almost 20% slower than the Xbox Series X and likely could fall even lower based on the game. Memory is pretty straightforward. Both consoles have 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. However, there are some slight differences. So the Xbox does have a wider memory bus, and because of that, 10 of their 16 gigabytes of RAM run at 560 gigabytes per second, which is slightly faster than what you get on PS5. But realistically, this is probably not going to be anywhere near the kind of delta that we saw, say, on last generation. Now for the SSD, the PS5 has an advantage, but it's not a super clear one. So yes, the PS5 does have a smaller 825 gig SSD compared to a 1 terabyte drive on the Xbox Series X. And yes, the PS5 does have a significantly faster one. So it will do 5.5 gigabytes per second raw, or 8 to 9 gigabytes compressed, whereas the Series X will do 2.4 gigabytes raw and 6 gigabytes compressed. So pretty major difference there. But the downside is that the Xbox, at least right now, has a much easier expansion. So once you fill up your PS5 drive, you're gonna have to start shuttling things around until at least we get SSDs, which are going to be fast enough. Whereas the Xbox, you can buy those expansion modules and use them pretty much day one. They might be expensive, but this is a little bit of a weird one. I'm really curious to see how well developers are able to take advantage of these speeds. Because while yes, it sounds like a big difference in theory, but the optimization here can make a huge difference, especially considering that these are so much faster than last generation. So when you look at everything we know about the PS5 and the Series X, they are roughly equivalent, right? They share a lot of the same sort of underpinnings, a lot of the same components, but there's a very clear advantage for the Xbox Series X. Now, does that mean that the Xbox Series X will be more expensive? I would expect so, right? So based on this, it looks like Sony is trying to push a smaller, cheaper design to higher clock speeds and sort of optimizing with like boost clocks and everything. But at the end of the day, I feel like we are in store for a really exciting generation. So I'm curious, what do you guys think about the PS5 launch announcement? What do you want to know? And how do you think it's going to stack up to the Series X? Are you actually going to pull the trigger on one? Or are you going to stay Team Sony, Team Xbox, or Team PC Master Race? A lot of people are going to say that one.